Tennessee law infringes on the rights of so-called trans kids. There are a few problems with that claim. First of all,
he's really embodying the guy at the bus stop who you probably walking the other direction away from.
Federal taxpayer dollars from being used to promote or pay for these types of procedures. Now, today will also mark the first time an openly trans litigator will argue a case before the Supreme Court. A decision is not expected for several months, and the ruling could possibly affect other laws and efforts to regulate things like sports competitions involving transgender people or which bathrooms they even use.
Obviously, I have nothing but bad news when it comes to what is being said inside the courtroom. It's exactly what you'd expect, a room full of old, white, cis men to be talking about. Well, mostly white, but still. Thomas and Alito will clearly vote to uphold bans on gender-affirming care for minors. I think Kavanaugh will too. He suggested that the Constitution is neutral on this issue and said, "We can't ignore the risks to this care to children." Robert leans towards upholding the bans, but still early. Kavanaugh is basically analogizing gender-affirming care to abortion, raising the same arguments that he did in the Dobbs about constitutionalizing a policy decision with strong feelings on both sides. He will perhaps write an opinion saying states can legalize or ban this care. See, I'm neutral. Kavanaugh also brings up detransitioners, people who, quote, regret their decision to transition genders. Like Alito, he cites European countries that are pulling back from gender-affirming care for minors, saying that it's a yellow light or red light for the court, that Europe is pumping the brakes, which, again, is false reporting. I believe Aaron Reed just posted a story about France, which is actually literally moving in the opposite direction. New French guidelines recommend trans youth care, denounce wait-and-see approach. The new guidelines published by the French Society of Pediatric Endocrinology and Diabetology create the first French national medical consensus on trans youth care. In a groundbreaking development for the care of transgender youth in France, the French Society of Pediatric Endocrinology and Diabetology has released what is being called the first French national medical consensus on trans youth care. The document's release comes as a variety of other countries consider politically influenced guidelines from the CAS review in the United Kingdom, which has since been completely debunked and utterly absurd and ridiculous. You can watch the many videos that I've done or other content creators have done debunking the CAS review, which has since been heavily criticized for its recommendations, rejected by multiple medical societies in other countries, including by medical societies here in Canada. Importantly, the new guidelines recommend trans youth care, denounce a wait-and-see approach for trans adolescents, and promote individualized care for each transgender patient. The guidelines described as both robust and extensive were meticulously prepared. According to the document, 1 to 3 authors were assigned to each section, conducting comprehensive literature reviews. Their findings were then refined through multiple iterations, and the input was from a broader group until consensus was achieved. Finally, the recommendations underwent review by external experts. The result is a thorough and authoritative set of guidelines aimed at providing clear direction for doctors caring for trans youth in France. The guidelines encompass a wide range of care recommendations for trans youth, offering official support for puberty blockers and gender-affirming hormone therapy. Regarding puberty blockers, the guidelines emphasize their role in allowing trans youth to explore their gender identity without the added distress of undergoing puberty, while also reducing the need for future surgeries. For hormone therapy, the recommendations advocate its use for trans youth who meet the criteria outlined in the ICD-11, ensuring the individualized and evidence-based approach to care. The recommendations strongly oppose a wait-and-see approach for trans adolescents, often referred to as gender exploratory therapy. This practice, considered a form of conversion therapy, seeks to attribute a trans person's identity to external factors rather than recognizing it as authentic, delaying access to care until adulthood. The guidelines reject this method, stating it does not reduce psychological distress, and instead increases the risk of committing suicide that can affect the psychoaffective and cognitive development. These findings align with a report from the U.S. Centers for Disease Control showing that 25% of trans youth in the United States have attempted suicide, alongside a study in Nature and Human Behavior indicating that anti-trans laws, including healthcare bans, have caused an increase of 72% in suicide attempts. The authors also refute suggestions in the CAS review around the negative impacts of trans healthcare. For example, the CAS review on several occasions speaks of the potential loss of bone density amongst trans youth taking puberty blockers. Instead, the French review notes that trans people have low bone densities regardless of treatment due to other factors. Trans youth have an average BMD before the onset of puberty that is lower than those of the general population, regardless of the treatment. This is probably related to the consequences of dysphoria, less physical activity, eating disorders, poor dietary balance. They also note that after moving to gender-affirming hormones, BMD comparable to that of experienced gender. They also recommend vitamin D and exercise to mitigate potential concerns. The group also, and this part is just, again, like so much of this entire topic, profoundly sad in that people will manipulate the realities that people who have gender dysphoria seem to have, varying degrees of discomfort, both with levels of stress, anxiety, which can lead obviously to having poor eating habits, to having poor exercise or physical activity, which then can lead to, yes, having a lower than average bone density than perhaps cis children, which then, if they receive gender affirmation and gender affirming care and less bigotry from society, it suddenly becomes comparable with their cis counterparts. So it's once again a case of like knowing that, in the same way that like the rates of suicidal ideation drop dramatically the more that there is social acceptance of trans people. So knowing that, why would you try to flip this upside down and then manipulate it to continue to, again, persecute this group of folk? Like it's profoundly evil to look at data or scientific investigations and then do what a lot of the people in the cast review had been doing, which is to take that information and be like, oh, we're going to weaponize that information to increase bigotry, which again, just evil fundamentally. The group also explored suggestions found in the cast review that puberty blockers could harm brain development. On this subject, they found that GnRHA treatments in trans adolescents have no negative effect on the association between intellectual quotient and academic success, nor on executive function performance. These guidelines are poised to resonate both in France and globally, as countries and major medical associations increasingly distance themselves from the UK's cast review, criticized for its connections to the SPLC-designated hate group. The scientific consensus continues to affirm the importance of gender-affirming care for trans youth. Their release comes just one day before the US Supreme Court hears oral arguments on healthcare bans targeting trans youth across the United States. In a climate where medical care for trans youth is under relentless political attack, guidelines like these offer a beacon of evidence-based practice and will be instrumental in shaping a future where access to essential care is protected and secured for all. Now, with a very notable exception of the province of Alberta, Canada still has pretty comprehensive access to gender-affirming care for youth, depending on which province you're in. Obviously, it's going to differ because it is a province-by-province basis, but the majority of the medical communities in Canada have a consensus that gender-affirming care is a valid form of healthcare. Every major medical association in the United States is in the exact same consensus as well. This is the consensus of the medical community that, again, if it's something that you don't understand or you are confused about or it worries you, or perhaps you've heard a Matt Walsh, soundbite or two that suddenly makes you a little bit concerned because you feel like they're giving sex change operations to little boys and little girls, which they are not. Most people, I would say most cis people especially, are woefully uninformed on this topic, which is why it's been so successful for the right to use this as a talking point and a distraction for the general public while they are still doing a whole bunch of terrible and evil shit. They can continue to make everyone afraid of a very small minority of the population. If there is 0.7 to about 1.7% of the population being trans or identifying as trans or having gender dysphoria in one way or another, then again, this is not the majority of the population. And of the people who are undergoing gender-affirming care, study after study, and if you combine the studies into meta-studies, show that an incredibly small percentage, in many cases less than 1%, of people who undergo gender-affirming care as youth regret it. Less than 1%. That again is something that I'm so glad certain writers, authors, as well as doctors and scientists have pointed out is profoundly cruel for the Jesse Singals and the other TERFs and transphobes and gender criticals of the world to continue to weaponize that less than 1% as a justification to be able to, again, pass legislation that is going to affect all trans people, all people who need gender-affirming care. If it is less than 1% of people who transition, especially who transition as youth, end up regretting it later in life, I mean, what other medical procedures do you have such high, satisfaction rates with? And I keep pointing towards things like knee surgery, which sometimes is between 20 to 30% regret rate. But there's regret rates for a lot of surgeries. And when you have such a low percentage of people who actually regret this, clearly there's something going on here. And why again, are us cis people trying to put ourselves in the middle of this, highly politicize this topic, turn it into a debate, one person's civil rights is another person's culture war, and then all of a sudden you have issues like this where you're getting this kind of shit. Kavanaugh brings up detransitioners, people who, quote, regret their decision to transition genders. Like Alito, he cites European countries that are pulling back from gender-affirming care for minors, saying it's a yellow light, red light for the court, that Europe is pumping the brakes. No, they are not. Again, it's so fucked up that we have a whole bunch of old cis dudes who are just standing in a room, doing the same things that they've been doing for generations. We're doomed to live in perpetual witch trials where like men are basically condescending towards women because they don't understand math, because that's scary to them. The idea of boiling water before one drinks it is witchcraft. Ah, a spell, I say, trying to prevent what? Disease? Huh? Washing of the body? What? You're saying that will lower the rate at which one gets sick? Haha, witchcraft, I say. Drown her. Like, we're still doing this shit. It's still a room full of uninformed men who are trying to make decisions in a group that doesn't directly concern them and pass legislation for people. And these are the kind of folk who are using fucking Yahoo search to look for Google to be able to access their emails. That's the degree of fucking tapped in they are. Meanwhile, they're spewing shit that you would hear Matt Walsh saying. That's, again, what's so profoundly frustrating about all this shit. Kavanaugh also asked about the effects on this case on women's and girls' sports, fretting that a decision letting trans athletes play on women's teams could raise competitive fairness and safety issues that have been vocally raised by some female athletes. You know what a lot of female athletes have been vocally raising the alarm about? How in a lot of leagues, say like soccer, there is sexual abuse in every fucking level of the sport. From children all the way to professional athletes, from Olympians all the way to people in schools. That's a huge problem. There's physical and sexual abuse of kids, not just in women's sports, by the way, in men's sports. Turns out the same thing is happening in hockey leagues in Canada on every fucking level. There is physical and sexual abuse, oftentimes people who are in positions of power, coaches, parents, etc. This is a real problem, one we should be addressing. If there's systemic fucking sexual and physical abuse of children happening in these leagues, yeah, that's a problem. It's not happening because of trans people. It's happening because of cis people, because of cis heterosexual men, who are the majority of the offenders, again, in all categories, across the board. That's never brought up, though. This is always brought up as well, you know what, for the first time in my life, I now care a lot about women's sports, specifically in this one issue, and I care about trans women in sports. But that's it. And TERFs, by the way, like J.K. Rowling, they're still out there pushing this idea that, like, why is it that you've never seen a trans-identifying male, biological female, succeeding in men's categories? One must assume that women are unable to beat men. Okay, first off, I think you're trying to say trans men. Why aren't trans men ever mentioned? And I guess to a certain extent that's true. Trans men aren't often left out of the conversation when it comes to sports. But there are instances where trans men are beating cis men. For example, I bring up that boxer who had a 3-0 record for a while and was actually having trouble. The dude was having trouble finding other men to fight because, yeah, surprise, surprise, there's a lot of insecure men, a lot of insecure boxing promoters who are sitting like, wait, what? There's like a trans man? Is that like a woman? Is that like a chick beating up dudes? No, I don't know if I want to participate. Well, yeah, for a while he was 3-0, and like this is a trans man. This was someone who was misidentified. There's also the case of the skateboarder not too long ago that Tim Pool was bringing up as an example of why trans women shouldn't participate in sports. Unfortunately, the example of the, again, skateboarder that he had brought up was him, and was non-binary and had transitioned after leaving the women's team. It only took, once again, a little bit of researching. I used Yahoo search, typed in Alta Vista, got to Alta Vista. I typed in how to Google something, and then another website, and then I typed in the name of that skateboarder. And then when I typed in his name, it turns out that he was non-binary, him, and that he had transitioned from the women's team after leaving the women's Olympic team, and is now a non-binary, him skateboarder. And no, it was not a case of a man who had falsely transitioned into a woman to then join the women's skateboarding team to win at skateboarding. And at its core, when it comes to the athletes and then the athletic debate, why doesn't anyone ever talk about money? Money. There's a huge unfair advantage in professional sports. It's money. It's money, time, and I'm sorry, genetics. Yeah, there are some people who have won the genetic lottery, and they are so good at a single sport that it's really hard for other people to compete against them. Michael Phelps is a great example of that. It's really hard to compete against Michael Phelps. There's someone made in a lab, the perfect human to specifically do one thing exceptionally well. exceptionally well. It's really unfair for other swimmers to swim against Michael Phelps. He beats them all the time. He just walks away from the Olympics like, I got 20 gold medals. This is a fucking joke. So is there ever going to be a challenge? That it feels unfair, but it's not unfair in the sense that this is a person who happens to be the best at what they do. Also, for a lot of professional athletes, you need parents who have the time to be able to wake up every morning at 4 a.m. to take their kids out, to be able to afford all the gear, to be able to afford the coaching, the tutorials, and all that kind of stuff to raise them from the moment they're born to hopefully at one day professionally becoming an athlete in, say, the NHL or the NBA. That can be really hard. That can cost a lot of money. It takes a lot of time and dedication and resources to be able to climb the ranks to be able to get that, chance. And even then, you might not make it because it's that competitive at the highest levels. But is that unfair? Is that unfair? And if this is a conversation about fairness, then in what way are we improving the quality of life for everybody if we're suddenly telling little boys and little girls they're not allowed to play sports in school, they have to feel othered, ostracized, feel worse about who they are because they're not considered a full little boy or a full little girl? Like, who at the end of the day, when this is honestly only happening to a very small amount of students, by the way, again, it's somewhere between 0.7 to sometimes 1.7% of the population, but we're only talking about a couple hundred kids who are then meant to feel shittier in their everyday life because it's like, oh, I'm sorry, you can't play on the sports team. It wouldn't be fair. Yeah, because you're not who you say you are. You are lying. We're going to tell you who you are right now. Amy Coney Barrett suggests that the healthcare ban might not be sex discrimination under the 14th Amendment because its burdens on the law fall equally on boys and girls because neither can transition. She asks if it would be seen as more targeted discrimination against trans people. Barrett says that looking at trans healthcare bans as sex discrimination feels like an odd way to solve the problem. She says the case is better framed as an anti-trans discrimination, but suggests the law has not traditionally discriminated against trans people, so they are not a suspect class. I think Barrett is wrong to say that there's a history of state discrimination against trans people in the US, but the problem is that discrimination often took the form of sex discrimination, enforcing sex stereotypes, for instance, and Barrett isn't seeing the connection. Barrett and other conservatives don't seem to see how state-sanctioned discrimination against trans people basically always takes the form of sex discrimination, imposing unique restrictions on people's rights based on their sex assigned at birth, frustrating that the argument isn't breaking through. I also can't get over the conservative justices favorably citing European laws about trans healthcare when they've vociferously refused to consider the other nations' laws and traditions when dealing with issues in which the US is an outlier, like gun violence and the death penalty. Which also, by the way, is one of those things where, like, what about the consensus of every major medical association in the United States, every major medical association in Canada, both of whom agree conclusively on this issue? Like, in what other cases is there where we pass laws or try to pass laws of discrimination based on a single study released in the UK that has been trumpeted by the world's biggest bigots? It's like, yes, that Glinner, J.K. Rowling, Matt Walsh, all super happy about the cast review, which has now been thoroughly discredited, which, again, the cast review has so many things that are profoundly, on its surface level, just false. And like, there is not a biological imperative for children to play with specific plastic objects. That is so bizarre to try and pass off as science, to be like, well, unfortunately, we now know that little boys, they are just in their DNA coded to want to play with trucks and hammers, and that's just who they are. And little girls are just encoded in their DNA to want to play with dolls and kitchen accessories and play house. That's just who they are. Like, even if a vast majority of young boys would want to play with superhero dolls and construction sets, and a vast majority of girls, had there not been any gender norms and forced imposition of any of this, and most girls wanted to play with, say, dolls and houses and stuff like that, although you're already hearing a lot of overlap between these two things. Is that every single person? And if it was every single person, is there an actual proof that that is somehow coded into our DNA? Because I question that. A lot of our DNA has not really fundamentally changed that much in the past, like 100,000 years, when a lot of those same toys and even substances didn't exist. We didn't have plastic back then, but for some reason, we're hard encoded into our DNA to simply gravitate towards, whoa, I am a boy. I see a little toy hammer. I want to play with that. Whoa, I'm a girl. I see a little princess chess doll. I want to play with that. Like, again, this stuff is just on its surface level absurd. But the cast review was taken as serious by so many different folk.
It's prescribed inconsistent with an individual's sex. Our argument is that that treats people differently because of their sex, and therefore the court has to treat it like all other forms of sex discrimination, and that's why it's unconstitutional.
Now, defense lawyers say the law doesn't discriminate because it applies to both boys and girls, adding the law actually protects children from what they say are irreversible, unproven medical procedures. Watch.
There's a huge placebo effect. Anytime a patient is told, you know, we're going to help you with this medication, you're going to feel better, it's going to be the answer to your problems, there's often an acute response that's positive to it.
Now, while plaintiffs will argue parents should decide what's best medical treatment for their kids, not governments, the defense will point to the European countries that pioneered this treatment that have started to pull back over concern.
By the way, if you didn't know, puberty blockers are approved by the FDA for the use on children in America, for the use on cis kids who go through precocious puberty, and it's not something that is controversial. It's not something that has people protesting. It's not something that has people standing outside a hospital saying you are irreversibly damaging children and this is going to remove their ability to have sexual pleasure, or any of the other weird arguments that you hear a lot of the transphobes incorporated, I should say at this point, loving to espouse. A lot of the things that cis people take for granted, I don't have to think twice. I don't really have a lot of obstacles or barriers if I wanted to get gender affirming care. If I started losing my hair, for example, I don't have to prove to a doctor that I'm cis and I'm worthy of having gender affirming care in the form of hair plugs. Most likely the barrier to entry of that would be money. Can you afford it? If I can, yes, then you can get it. Yeah, it's a couple $1,000s. We'll do the surgery. No problem. And I won't get protested, by the way. There will not be a whole bunch of people standing outside of the hospital being like, you're mutilating your body, Lance. Don't do this. Don't get gender affirming care. No one cares. No one cares about the thousands of teenagers who get all forms of gender affirming care, nose jobs, boob jobs, all that kind of stuff. It's happening to teenagers. They're mutilating teenagers. All these procedures. But if it's cis kids, no one cares. There is no debate. There is no fucking, we need to see whether or not this is actually going to fall within the bounds of gender ideology or any of that kind of shit.
In terms of safety and effectiveness.
Richard, what are the broader implications of the eventual ruling from the Supreme Court here?
Yeah, Heather, we don't expect a ruling anytime soon, but it could have a major impact to the more than 24 Republican-led states that have enacted similar laws. That's basically half the country. Now, the court could either strike them all down or send a power...
Yeah, not only is it bigotry, it's a massive ass distraction. Think of how many resources are being spent on this entire ordeal right now. To have this being not only heard by, the Supreme Court, who's most likely, unfortunately, for the foreseeable future, going to be handing on down horrifying right-wing decisions. That's just the future of decision-making in America, it seems, because it is completely stacked right now with a plurality of far-right fucking Supreme Court justices who, unfortunately, have lifetime appointments unless they decide to either retire or they pass away. That's just how the system works, as is. And I don't know if there's, like, today as many hate watchers as there is for some other segments. Sometimes there is. If you happen to be someone who's hate watching me right now and you're just like, yeah, but this is, I've heard from Matt Walsh or someone else that this is the mutilation of children. Look, as of maybe 10, 12 years ago, I will say this, as a cis man, I, by definition, most likely would have been what one considers a transphobe or espousing transphobia, because it's a topic I didn't know about. So I get that there is that gap right now where if you are getting your information from, again, right-wing pundits or personalities, you might feel as if you're very informed on this topic, as I myself, maybe, again, 10 to 12 years ago, would have been saying the same kind of things because I didn't understand it. And in not understanding it, that's where a lot of this bigotry can come from. And unfortunately, once you do actually start researching this topic, or you do start actually learning about it, and you start listening to, again, what every major medical association in the US and Canada conclusively agrees on. There is a scientific consensus on this. This is not something in which some of the scientists think this might be a possibility, some of the scientists don't, they're not entirely sure. There's a handful, yes, of course, in any given topic of anything, in perpetuity, a handful of doctors who are going to say, oh, I don't agree with the medical findings. I think it's wrong. Fine, but again, this is something that I'm not a scientist, and most likely if you are listening to this, you're not a scientist either, so we have to listen to them. And now, take a 2-second pause to enjoy the wonderful tranquility of Chico sleeping, and in there we can all reset and start to, have a conversation about this that's not directly based in nonsense like it seems to be. Outside, of course, is one Matt Walsh, looking as disheveled as ever as he continues to do his very important work of endangering minorities for money.
Now, the other side claims that this is a case about rights. They say that the Tennessee law infringes on the rights of so-called trans kids. There are a few problems with that claim. First of all,
he's really embodying the guy at the bus stop who you probably walk in the other direction away from, hey? Who's just like, you have to listen to me, I have opinions and I need to be heard.
There's no such thing as a trans kid. That doesn't exist. Those kids are not trans. They are confused, and their confusion has been exploited by quacks and abusers. They are abuse victims. They are not trans.
So this is all projection. This is literally what he does for a living. This is his job. And the language here, right, it's very frightening in that it's eliminationist. It's first not only saying that, hey, by the way, I'm as a conservative completely all right with you as an adult. If you want to do what you want to do, it's not my business. I'm not here. I'm here to protect them kids. But he's not using those words. He's not even speaking that way anymore. This is just straight up, there's no such thing as trans people. We need to eliminate trans ideology. Like, this is eliminationist rhetoric.
Trans kids. Second, the law in Tennessee isn't banning kids from doing anything. It's banning doctors from causing permanent damage to kids. This is a ban targeting doctors and parents who are abusive and who are themselves targeting children. So what
Again, the weirdo at the bus stop who's probably had a little bit too much ether that day and is coming forward and saying, this is my business. It's not between the parents. It's not the parents or the doctors. It's me. I get to decide. That's the argument. That's the argument that he's making right now. I'm the person who gets to be inside the doctor's room or the patient's room or the school or the hospital with your kids.
Trans activists, what the people over there are actually claiming is not that kids have a right to be castrated, but that doctors have the right to castrate them. They are fighting for the right of adults to abuse and harm and mutilate and permanently damage and destroy children. That's what all those people over there are fighting for.
And what he's doing isn't new, right? It's been done throughout history to try and misrepresent, or battle against scientific consensus or scientific findings, or try to manipulate the very idea of science to be able to justify bigotry in one way or another, whether that be measuring skulls, whether that be eugenics, whether that be phrenology. You're dealing with someone who, again, proudly boasts every single time that he's given the opportunity to speak at one of these conferences that he has absolutely no background, training, or education on this subject. He's just got feelings and opinions, and they're very, very strong, and they're rooted in Christian nationalism, and again feels that he then has the right to be able to dictate what your children do. They're coming for your kids.
It's disgusting, it's evil. Now third, finally, with all that said, I actually agree with the premise, sort of. This case is about the rights of children. It's about the right of a child to be protected from the gender butchers. That's what it's about. Children have the constitutional right, the human right, the God-given right to live and grow and learn about themselves and the world.
So again, profoundly evil fucks, and like it should just be reported on for exactly what it is, that he is trying to harm children, and he's trying to hurt children, and in some cases kill children. right? Like I say that without any worry about him suing me, because at the end of the day, what he's advocating for increases suicidal ideation, increases anxiety, depression experienced by queer kids, makes them feel more unsafe, and tries to create and normalize bigotry on a mass-wide scale for, again, stuff that he does not understand and has absolutely no experience in. We are not going to rest until every child is protected, until trans ideology is entirely erased from this earth. Again, this is eliminationist, eradicationist language by extremists.
Thank you so much for watching, everyone. This independent series is made entirely possible thanks to our patrons. It was produced by Anna Loves Riley, Arian McCarthy, Bobby Lasers, Cheryl Alvarez, Comrade Junkie, Doug Caddy, Everything Important, Hagbard Celine, Jimmy Sombrero, Multimondi, Omni, Political Papi, Preston Kroll, Quiet 185, Richard Bohem, Riley and Anna, Roller Dragon, Cernicus, Stellar Gwyn, Sebastian Demmel, and Words Greenwood. Not to mention all the other patrons you now see on screen. We couldn't have done this show without you. If you can help support the show, please check out patreon.com/the Serfs to unlock bonus secret episodes, as well as get the content before anyone else.